It was supposed to be just another quiet evening in the small town of Ridgewood. Officer Carl Dunn leaned against his patrol car, the glow of the setting sun bouncing off his sunglasses, scanning the nearly empty street. For years, Carl had earned a reputation in town, a man who didn't take kindly to strangers, especially if their skin wasn't the same shade as his. He never saw himself as a bad guy. To him, he was just keeping order. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the scales of justice were about to tip in ways Carl couldn't imagine. At the same time, Michael Carter was heading into Ridgewood for what he thought would be a routine trip. A tall, sharp-dressed man in his late 30s, Michael had spent most of his adult life in high-pressure situations as an undercover CIA agent. He was good at blending in, reading people, and staying calm under fire, skills that had saved his life more times than he could count. But tonight wasn't about espionage or international threats. Michael had come back to visit an old friend who had recently moved to Ridgewood, a quiet detour from the chaos that usually defined his life. As Michael drove his black SUV down the main street, the hum of his tires seemed to echo louder than usual. Ridgewood wasn't the kind of place where outsiders went unnoticed. Carl spotted the unfamiliar car immediately, and something in him bristled. To Carl, the sight of a black man in a high-end vehicle didn't fit the narrative of his town. With his jaw clenched, Carl reached for his petrol lights and flicked them on. Michael, used to staying calm in the face of tension, glanced in the rearview mirror as the flashing red and blue lights filled his car. He sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. His training told him to stay composed. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over for what he suspected wasn't a real reason, and he doubted it would be the last. Carl approached the car with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, even though there was no visible threat. "License and registration," he barked, his voice carrying an edge that wasn't lost on Michael. Michael handed over his documents without a word, his expression calm but guarded. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. "You tell me," Carl snapped, glancing over the papers and back at Michael, his eyes narrowing. "What's a guy like you driving a car like this, huh? Don't see many of your kind around here." Michael felt the weight of those words, the unspoken implication hanging in the air. He wanted to respond, to challenge the insult, but years of training had taught him patience. Instead, he said calmly, "I'm just passing through. Is there a reason I was stopped?" Carl ignored the question, motioning for Michael to step out of the vehicle. "Let's see what you're really up to," he muttered. Michael hesitated, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't carrying any weapons. He didn't need to, given his line of work. But he knew how quickly things could escalate in situations like this. Still, compliance was often the safest option. He opened the door and stepped out, his hands visible and non-threatening. But Carl wasn't satisfied. He grabbed Michael by the arm, roughly spinning him around and slamming him against the side of the car. "What are you hiding?" Carl demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. Michael gritted his teeth, the sting of metal and glass against his cheek reminding him of darker days he left behind. He could feel the stares of bystanders who had stopped to watch the unfolding scene, their murmurs blending into a low hum of unease. Then, just as Carl was about to cross another line, Michael turned his head slightly and said, "You might want to take your hands off me, officer." The tone in his voice wasn't aggressive. It was controlled, calm, and full of authority. But it wasn't the tone that made Carl hesitate. It was the cold, sharp look in Michael's eyes. "What did you just say to me?" Carl growled, his grip tightening. Michael sighed. He knew this moment was inevitable, but he also knew the power of timing. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" Carl scoffed, but a flicker of uncertainty passed across his face. Michael took a deep breath. "Call it in," he said firmly. "Run my name. And then we'll see how this ends." For a moment, Carl froze, the weight of Michael's words sinking in, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached for his radio, his hand trembling ever so slightly. As he relayed Michael's name and description, the air grew heavier, the tension crackling like static electricity. And then the reply came through. The voice on the other end was sharp and urgent. Do not detain that man. Release him immediately. Repeat, release him immediately. Carl's face paled, the color draining as he stared at Michael, who now wore the faintest hint of a knowing smile. Who are you? Carl stammered, his bravado crumbling. Michael straightened up, brushing off his jacket as he fixed Carl with a piercing gaze. I tried to warn you, he said, his voice calm but steely. And as Carl stood there, paralyzed by a mix of fear and disbelief, Michael leaned in just close enough to whisper, "The gates of justice swing both ways, Officer Dunn. I hope you're ready for what comes next." Michael walked calmly away from the patrol car, his steps measured and deliberate, as though every move he made was calculated. His back was straight, his expression unreadable. Carl, still frozen in place, watched him go, his chest tightening with a mix of dread and confusion. The buzz of the radio in his patrol car grew louder, but he couldn't bring himself to pick it up. His hands were still shaking. Inside, Carl's mind raced. He'd been an officer for over a decade, and never once had someone rattled him like this. Michael Carter wasn't like the other people Carl had stopped. There was something in the man's composure, the way he spoke with authority but without fear. It gnawed at Carl, the realization that he might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. Michael, meanwhile, continued down the sidewalk, ignoring the stares of the small crowd that had gathered. He could feel their curiosity, the weight of their eyes trying to piece together what had just happened. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not yet. The sun was almost gone now, the last bits of daylight casting long shadows across the street. Michael slipped into the nearest alley, letting the darkness envelop him. Pulling out his phone, Michael tapped the screen a few times and held it to his ear. A voice on the other end answered almost immediately. "Carter," the voice said, low and serious. "I've been compromised," Michael replied quietly. "A local cop decided to get brave. My cover's intact for now, but this might get messy." There was a pause on the other end. "Do you need extraction?" Michael shook his head, even though no one could see him. "Not yet, but I need you to keep an eye on Ridgewood. Things here, they might escalate." The voice responded without hesitation. "Understood. We'll keep you updated. Stay safe." Michael ended the call and leaned against the brick wall behind him, his eyes scanning the quiet alley. He hadn't planned on drawing this much attention so soon, but Carl's actions had forced his hand. He knew the officer wouldn't let this go. Men like Carl rarely did. Back at the patrol car, Carl finally snapped out of his daze and grabbed his radio. "Dispatch," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. "This is Officer Dunn. I need more information on the suspect I just stopped. Michael Carter." The dispatcher's voice came through, calm but firm. "Officer Dunn, you're advised to leave this matter alone. Higher authorities have already been notified." Carl's jaw tightened. "What do you mean, leave it alone?" "I need to know who this guy is." There was a brief silence on the line before the dispatcher replied. "That's classified. Stand down, Officer Dunn. This is above your pay grade." The words stung, hitting Carl like a slap to the face. Above his pay grade, he'd spent years building his career, earning the respect, or fear, of everyone in Ridgewood. The idea that someone like Michael Carter could waltz into town and turn his world upside down didn't sit well with him. But what Carl didn't realize was that this wasn't just about him. Michael's presence in Ridgewood was no accident. He was here for a reason, one that had nothing to do with Carl's bruised ego. As Michael emerged from the alley and continued walking through the town, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. His mission in Ridgewood was delicate, requiring precision and discretion. He couldn't afford any more attention, especially not from the local police. But now that the situation had escalated, he needed to reassess his strategy. His thoughts drifted back to the past, to the countless missions he'd undertaken for the CIA. He'd infiltrated drug cartels, dismantled terrorist cells, and negotiated with warlords. He'd seen the darkest parts of humanity and survived to tell the tale. But this mission felt different, personal. Michael's steps eventually led him to a small diner on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a pale glow on the cracked pavement outside. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, the smell of coffee and fried food greeting him like an old friend. A waitress behind the counter glanced up, her tired eyes widening slightly when she saw him. "You're not from around here," she said, her tone more curious than accusatory. Michael offered a small smile. "Just passing through." She nodded, motioning to an empty booth by the window. "Take a seat. I'll be right with you." Michael slid into the booth, his back to the wall so he could see the entrance. Old habits. As he waited, he pulled out his phone and checked his messages. Most were encrypted updates from his team, but one caught his attention, a name he hadn't seen in years. "Meet me at the old mill," the message read. Michael frowned, his mind racing. The old mill was just outside Ridgewood, a crumbling relic from a time long past. It was the kind of place you went when you didn't want to be found. The waitress approached, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. "Here you go," she said, setting it down in front of him. "Need anything else?" Michael shook his head. "This is fine, thank you." She lingered for a moment, her curiosity evident. "You don't seem like the type to just pass through a place like this," she said carefully. Michael looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "And what type do I seem like?" She shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "The type that's here for a reason." Michael didn't respond, instead lifting the coffee to his lips and taking a slow sip. The warmth of the drink did little to ease the chill that had settled in his chest. Meanwhile, Carl sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The dispatcher's warning replayed in his mind over and over. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being kept in the dark about something big. And Carl hated being in the dark. With a growl of frustration, he slammed the car into gear and pulled out onto the road. If the system wasn't going to give him answers, he'd find them himself. As he drove through the quiet streets, his eyes scanned the sidewalks, searching for any sign of Michael. But the man was nowhere to be found. Unbeknownst to Carl, Michael was already preparing for the next step of his mission. The message about the old mill had thrown a wrench into his plans, but he couldn't ignore it. If the sender was who he thought it was, this meeting could change everything. The night deepened, the town of Ridgewood slipping into an uneasy silence. But for Michael and Carl, the night was far from over. The tension between them, between their worlds, was building, inching closer to a breaking point that neither of them fully understood yet. And somewhere in the shadows, forces larger than either man were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move.